Hey, Melanie.
Derek,
We have a birthday to celebrate.
is this yours?
Not mine.
Um, I feel like I should know. Tell me.
This is, well, birthday is probably the wrong word, but
Oh,
this is
this is
the
not.
50th anniversary of hip hop.
That's right. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Yes, that is quite on my mind.
Yes. So it keeps coming to mind because I saw that article in the New York Times about how New York City is celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip hop through different events around the city. And I'm like, man, I wish I were there because I don't know if any other place is doing that.
Yeah, Boston is doing it in its bits. There have been some live performances. A local independent theater here is doing a whole series in August of hip hop films. Yeah, so it's on the mind.
Okay. I
Mhm.
mean, now I'm thinking back to like Grandmaster Flash and all those folks, and just some of the earlier pioneers of hip hop. And like, I should listen to them again. I haven't listened to them
Yes.
in a while.
Yes, and there are a couple of good documentaries and documentary series that have come out in the last couple of years anticipating this.
Hmm.
Good to delve into that I've been meaning to make some time for. So,
And now that I think about it, I remember a few years ago, just as the pandemic was hitting, I met two folks who I think were putting together the hip hop museum in the Bronx.
oh,
Don't know how far that's gone. I don't know if they were looking at a space. I don't know if they actually secured the space and started building it out, but it was something that I was like, oh, this is cool if they could make it happen.
I think we know somebody we can ask who might have an answer about that.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's true. Today's guest is who I think you're talking about.
Yes.
And why we're bringing up hip hop. So today's guest, when he was doing his research on hip hop, he started coming across different aspects of redlining, which is what today's topic is.
Wow.
So redlining, we were talking about how do we define redlining, and I gave my definition. Do you have a definition that's similar, or do you want to give your definition?
I like yours. I like yours. It's really succinct.
So the definition that we were talking about was, what that I explained around redlining was that it was a process by which the government and the banks colluded to keep mostly Black people, but people of color and some Jewish people as well, out of being. They stopped them from being able to buy houses, and so they would literally take maps of cities and draw red lines around certain neighborhoods to say these neighborhoods are declining, these neighborhoods are not worth investing mortgages in. And so, therefore, people who were living in those neighborhoods could not get mortgages or could not get them easily. And a lot of people who were deemed to be undesirable were sort of forced to move into those neighborhoods. And so that has had a long term effect, I should say, on how people build wealth and gain wealth over time, both individually, in their families, and in their communities at large.
And the makeup of urban neighborhoods, cities, and surrounding suburbs.
Yeah. So I think we should bring on our guest.
Yes, I'm excited about our guest.
Yeah.
Mm,
You want to do
Yeah,
a quick intro?
yeah, I'm happy to. Dr. J. M. Williams, affectionately known as Dr. J, is an award winning educator. In 2022, Williams was awarded the prestigious Dean's Medal for outstanding doctoral work for his dissertation titled America's Empathy Deficit, Our Bloody Heirloom, and the Invisible Backpack, a Northeastern University honor, highest honor of Northeastern University. Jay has spent over a decade in education supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in K through 12 and at the college and university levels. His research highlights how the history of race in America and higher education play a role in the lack of, I think this is diverse stories we see in the mainstream media. Jay has spent over a decade in education supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so we're just excited to bring him on. Wanted to note that one of his more recent projects in 2022, he launched the Creative Cafe Collective, a media production company that features the popular podcast Dr. J's Office Hours, which focuses on building a dynamic learning community anchored in social justice. I'm excited to learn more about that as well.
Same here. Dr. J, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. How y'all doing? How y'all doing? I'm excited for this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on board. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah.
So, as you probably heard us talking about, this is the 50th anniversary of hip hop. So,
Hmm.
congratulations to hip hop. But we know that that was the doorway by which you began looking into redlining. So, could you
Hmm.
tell us a little bit about like how you made that connection and like how did it all begin for you?
Sure. So, as Melanie shared earlier, much of my studies was really steeped in the different dynamics of race in America and how and its various ripples, right? And so, I had an understanding of what redlining was, whether it be through conversation or just sort of growing up in a Black community. It's just a part of the top of our consciousness as it relates to home ownership and education systems, etc. So, but it was kind of like something that was like abstract and over there. I didn't really have a concrete understanding of it, of how how its ripples affected me right now today. Right. I it always felt like redlining happens like years ago and we still feel it, just like how oftentimes racism is considered. So like, oh, civil rights, that happened like 60 years ago, right? Like, oh, this, that was something that's over there. Meanwhile, it's like right here in our faces every single day. And so I share that to say I developed this. I'm a full-time faculty member, and one of the courses that I developed recently was called Hip Hop Culture in the New Economy.
Hmm.
And what I found in doing my research in hip hop is the question that I asked was, when hip hop started, what was the context that it started in? What was actually happening in the
Yes.
Bronx, New York during that time? That was the question that I asked, because what I try to share with my students is that hip hop is more than a music genre. It's a culture, and it has a lot of different elements to it. And I wanted to know something that is so profound. You talked about, celebrating 50 years, right? What was happening 50 years ago to those teenagers to where they created a global culture, something that is so powerful and influential, and what I feel is so profound, and how we see and consume goods, whether that's the
Yeah.
places we live, the fashion that we have, the music we listen to, all those different things. And so I looked at sort of the history of hip hop, and we knew what I found is hip hop was founded August 11, 1973 in the Bronx, New York, right? 50 years ago. And then I said, well, Kool Herc, Cindy and Clive Campbell was wanted to start a party.
Mm,
They didn't have enough money for school clothes, so they hustled and was just like, we're gonna start a party and charge people a fee to come to our basement, our community center in the basement of our housing project.
yes.
And then I said, I've seen them. My family has grown up in the projects, but I didn't understand what is a project, and why is that
Yeah.
a thing. It took me till that long to actually ask that question of like, where did projects come from? So then the research began. So now the first day of class, so I got all my information, and so now this is the first day of class, and I said to my students, I said, what if I told you a president in the 1930s was a pioneer of hip hop? And all the students had this like puzzled look on their face. They kind of like chuckled, like, well, that doesn't really make sense. So in the 1930s, there was the Great Depression. We had a president called Franklin Delano Roosevelt, however you want to say it, right? He understood that there was a huge economic crisis in America. And so he created something called the New Deal.
Yes.
And in the New Deal, there were a lot of different elements on how to uplift the economy in America. One of those things was developing the housing authority or projects to get Americans to go to work. In the process of, which is now we're looking at 1934, the first housing development was created. And that then lays the groundwork for HOLC, which is essentially the organization that created mortgages. And when you create these mortgages, it's Homeowners Loan Corporation. That's what HOLC stands for. And when they created this, they said, well, how are we going to value these neighborhoods so that we can then hand out loans based upon the value of those neighborhoods? Okay, we're going to bring these folks to the table, these NAP folks, and we're going to draw lines around these neighborhoods that we deem as valuable. But it just so happened that the neighborhoods that were undesirable, risky, just happened to have a high population of Black and brown folks. Fast forward to 1973. Years and years, decades of divestment in neighborhoods based upon these lines that were created back in the 30s when HOLC was first created. Banks felt that it was a business decision to divest funds from these neighborhoods. Now we enter 1973 in New York City, specifically the Bronx. Well, what was happening in the 1970s in the Bronx? If you Google it, what you will find is something very interesting. If anybody who's listening or watching is sports fans, there was a Yankees game in the 1970s, and it was a home run hit during this Yankees game. And the camera panned, the ball went so far over the stands that the camera panned, and all you saw in the night was these fires in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And the comment was made that the Bronx is burning.
Yes.
So the fires were in the Bronx.
Now,
yes.
Right. So you're with me. You guys are with me, right?
Yep.
So now my students are like, okay, this is I don't know where this is going, but they're leaning in at this point. So now I said, okay, but why was the Bronx burning? So now we talked about the Great Depression, we talked about the New Deal, we talked about how projects was created, housing authority was created, we talked about redlining, but what does that have to do with the Bronx? So in the 1970s, the Bronx had what they call, there's a documentary in a book, but the documentary, I highly recommend those who are listening to check it out. It's literally called The Decade of Fire. And the Decade of Fire was this phenomenon that happened in the Bronx, New York, where for 10 years, there were approximately 40 fires per day in the Bronx, New York.
Wow.
Well, then they say, well, Dr. J, well, why was there fires? Well, remember how I said that there was this thing called redlining and divestment in neighborhoods. In the 1970s, there was an economic crisis in New York City. And the mayor at the time said, well, we need to cut back to figure out this financial crisis. We need to cut back on some of these resources in some of these areas. So it just so happened that he cut back municipalities in certain neighborhoods, one of which was fire departments in the Bronx to save money. And so when you start divesting in the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that you have chosen to divest in were created by the red lines that happened 40 years ago, you begin to see the ripples of redlining into today. And when I say today, I'm talking about 1970, right? Now you say, okay, well, the 1970s are here. The Bronx is on fire, literally. Kids are walking to and from school every day, experiencing this trauma of literally their neighborhood in ashes. And parents are not working. Neighborhoods are burning, violence. This is right before the crack era comes in the 1980s. And you have the Vietnam War. You have all of these things, like it's almost like it's piled on top of just trying to live life and survive. And you look at, well, why are these kids, why didn't they have enough money? Well, they didn't have enough money because the parents didn't have, there was no work. There was no investment in that community. They had to go 2 hours away, 45 hours away just to get jobs. So everybody, it was almost like the perfect storm for something beautiful to be created. But we can only say that because hindsight's 2020. During that time, imagine being 13, 14, 15 years old in the summer, trying to go back to school, and you're literally, your neighbor's house could have burned down the night before. So I thought it was ironic that these students, these high school students, were trying to make the best of their scenario in a project building. 1520 Sedgwick Ave was a public housing complex. The basement where hip hop was created was at the basement of a public housing building. And so we talk about redlining and how its inception came from the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, and how that laid the groundwork for public housing, and how public housing and the circumstance of the Bronx, New York, and it being burning were all a part of the ingredients for a rebellion, for an empowerment, for an expression of the life experience of those individuals who were literally in a neighborhood that was on fire. Gives you a better understanding of the power, of the influence, of the resilience of those young people in 1973. Never mind racism in the 70s, right? Never mind all of that. Just if you just take that, just that in the moment, it's, to me, it's remarkable. And so that's when I began my deeper dive into the ripples of redlining and how it's still felt today, based upon what you guys talked about earlier in the conversation, the celebration of 50 years of hip hop. And when I share with my students, I'm not a political person. 3 things that I find very difficult to talk about in an educational setting: religion, race, and politics. Those are the 3 things that are extremely difficult to talk about. But one cannot talk about hip hop without talking about the political implications that helped create the phenomenon that we celebrate today. So hopefully that wasn't too much, but that's kind of my journey into my understanding of redlining.
No, I feel like I got a free class in the past 10 minutes. I mean, like I was just in a lecture, one of your lectures. But as you were talking, I was looking up some images just so we can help the viewers sort of conceptualize a little bit better. So I found this fire. It's not the best picture I could find. There were some others, but this just illustrates how you have, if you know New York City, even if you don't know New York City, if you've just seen it on TV, you know, they have a lot of high rises. So, 6, 10, 12 stories high. And so, just seeing a building like this, just ablaze, just, lit. And there were probably people living in the apartments just to the left where, it's not yet on fire, but yeah, this was what New York City was dealing with. And at the same time, I remember learning that New York City also was bankrupt, and the president at the time was quoted as saying New York City dropped dead, and he wasn't offering to help bail out the city. So, some of the economic and physical conditions that you were talking about definitely show up in the historic record. And I think, I just wanted to show some illustration of what you were talking about to help people conceptualize a little bit better.
Thank you, Derek. And I would also say, this is my own guess all along. I've never actually done the research myself, and Jay, you might know, but I actually also assumed that those fires were due to basically corruption on the part of landowners, that they could cash in on insurance by letting those buildings burn. So I actually thought that that was a tactic. But I don't know that for certain. But what we do know is that whole blocks were burnt out, families were displaced, and kids were like on the street, not even with places to play because so much had been burnt to ashes.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a combination. You know, your point is so valid in terms of, you know, landlords using, you know, this phenomenon to leverage, you know, insurance claims to be able to, but the building and the divestment in the community had already started before we even got there. So
Yeah.
it just, for lack of better words and no pun intended, it would added fuel to the fire, right?
Yes.
It's just like, well, the neighborhoods are abandoned. It's no police are
No
not
one
coming.
cares.
You
That's
know,
right.
there's no one cares about this neighborhood anyway. So I might as well get a check. And it just continued and continued and continued to happen. And particularly, you know, when you have you know, divestment in neighborhoods and you have all these abandoned buildings, people start to squat, and all it
Yes.
takes is one cigarette, right? You know, if you have a building that's been sitting for 20-30 years and someone lights a cigarette and falls asleep, that then
Yep.
becomes a much bigger issue even before the landlords are starting to
That's right.
intentionally set fires. So I think it was a combination of both.
Yep.
So as we think about, so you know, we covered how hip hop and redlining sort of overlapped, but what kept you moving in the direction of redlining? Because part of what attracted us to having you here today was some writing you've done on LinkedIn on redlining. So what kept you moving in that direction?
Really, it was more or less trying to understand how redlining impacts what we see and feel today. Just like I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about cost of living, and a lot of the conversations that I'm having with college students is, you know, where they're going to get a job and where they live. Those are the two biggest things that they talk about. And where they get a job is going, more often than not, unless you're working remotely somewhere, where they get a job is going to be directly correlated to where they live. And how do those two things correlate? And one of the things, at least in Boston, it's very difficult for a entry level anybody, most professions, to be able to live comfortably in the with the cost of living in Boston. And so why is it like that? And Melanie and you both, I'm sure you can attest to this also phenomenon called gentrification. And gentrification doesn't really happen without redlining. It's not
Yes.
the impacts are not as vast without redlining,
That's right.
right? And so when we're looking at neighborhoods that like for example, I grew up in West Medford, which is one of or the oldest historically black community in America, right? I grew up in that neighborhood. My parents moved from Chicago, south side of Chicago, to West Medford with the intention of being around you know, the black and brown folks in a middle class neighborhood. That was in the early 90s. Now you go back to that neighborhood, there's very few black families that live in that neighborhood. Why? Why is that? And I'm sure you could say the same for places in Roxbury, Dorchester, those places that are traditionally populated by black and brown folks. That's the gentrification that I'm talking about, right? And so when we're talking about, well, where am I can't work at this organization because this organization is only going to pay me X amount of dollars, but my rent is
Yeah.
$2,400. I love this job, but I can't afford the rent, so therefore I can't work here. Or if I do work here, I have to get 3 and 4 roommates because I can't afford to live on my own and sustain myself based upon the cost of this living. And so we have to look at, how did we get here? Right? To where folks really have to pick and choose their jobs before taking on a career. Like that, like I can't do this career, this thing that I love, because this thing that I love isn't going to help support me and my family. That's
Yeah.
a very real conversation.
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that wasn't necessarily had before redlining came into play. it was just like, I'm going to work, and this job, whatever the job is going to allow me to take care of my family. Now the conversation is more difficult.
You mean once gentrification has come into play?
Yeah, all of these things where it's just like, well, my grandmother and them used to stay in this neighborhood, and they would stay here for years.
Because of
I can't stay in that same neighborhood that my family grew up in for 50 years because I've been priced out. Why? Why is that? And that's kind of been my continuous journey of trying to understand the why, because we can all look at things and be like, it is what it is. Like, I can't do anything about it. But for me, particularly as an educator, I want students to understand why, so that when they do get into these conversations or do go to the voting polls or are writing or reading about certain things, you have a full understanding of the history and context of why things are so, versus just taking things for face value. And I don't pretend to know everything about redlining or gentrification, but what I do know is that the ripples of redlining, although it was outlawed in the 60s, is clearly felt today. It's clearly felt today. And if you talking about so the ups and downs of the housing market throughout the years from 2008 till now, you can't talk about that without talking about gentrification. You can't talk about that without talking about redlining, because otherwise you be sort of naive or willfully ignorant to the fact that history played an incredible role in what we're seeing today and how we look at what is considered a nice neighborhood, what is considered a good school district, what is considered a safe community, right? What is considered to be an area that has a food desert? Well, what does a food desert mean? What does a good school mean? What does a safe neighborhood mean, and why? Because typically, not all the time, but typically, a neighborhood that is considered safe, a neighborhood that considered to have a good school system, typically is absent of Black and brown folks. And why is that? And so here we are.
Right. Yeah. When I think about redlining and gentrification and some of the physical implications that some of the policies of the past have on today, the one that I think of most often is the highway system. So when Eisenhower was beginning to have the highway system designed, a lot of times they could have easily avoided urban neighborhoods that had a lot of Black and brown people, but they deliberately chose to route the highways through those neighborhoods because they were all across the country, somehow they were all deemed blighted at the same time. And then the highways are routed through them, and then those folks had to move. They had to move further out, or just to different parts of the same city. But it was an intentional effort to disenfranchise and also prevent people from having homes, owning their homes, owning their businesses as well, because it wasn't just about houses, it was also about businesses, and having that economic foundation that would have carried through future generations. So yeah, that's one of the things that I think about is like the highway system, in addition to people just being completely disenfranchised in many, many, many other ways in the past couple of decades. Well, the past many past decades.
Yeah,
it's just such an interesting dynamic of like, hey, if I want to live 15 minutes from my job, I'm going to have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to do so. You know what I mean? And that's where like the highways and like convenience and all those things come into play, where back in the day when the factories were built, like folks lived within a couple of miles of their house, and that's like, to do that now, it's just like, you can, but it's only going to be for those who are on the upper echelon of income, which I think is incredibly unfortunate.
Yeah, we're seeing a return to the cities. There was urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, a clearing out of the cities and building more and more housing projects, and people moving who had the means, escaping to the suburbs, and those are usually white people. And we're in an era where people who have more means are moving into the city. People who don't typically have means, who could only be in the city, frankly have to leave. And but it's not like, I don't know. I'm listening to everything you all are saying, and I'm like, well, how do I contribute to this conversation as somebody who is in the midst of it? I help people buy and sell homes. I help people decide where and how best to put their money, as it relates to housing. What's the best thing you can do at this time, given your priorities, your needs, your resources? And the trend is so obvious. What's unclear to me about the trend is, what does this mean demographically, like you're describing, Jay, about a new generation, this current generation of young adults of color? Where do they root? Are they able to root in communities that reflect them? Are they spread out in suburbs that are far, far from their cultural and historic core? I don't know. I mean, I'm really trying to take it all in myself,
But
because
Melanie,
things is ironic. People earn more money now than the generations of their working class predecessors who had jobs at factories in the cities near where they live. They earn more, but housing, the cost of living overall is just so much higher. Then that's irrelevant. You don't actually, in real dollars, earn more. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
no, I was going to say, so you were asking the question of like, as someone who's in the real estate industry, how do you help people sort of navigate some of the forces around redlining and displacement and gentrification? But I think you are doing that. So when I think of how you helped me with buying my first house, you helped me analyze the options that I had, and you helped me make some of the best choices that I could, given the factors that were in front of me and given the amount that I could spend. So I mean, you're doing it, but I think it's the scale of what's happening is beyond just you. It's beyond any number of realtors. The scale is just so massive that even if all of the realtors in America, if all the realtors across the land said, hey, we're going to help Black and brown people make the best decisions that they can, there's still not going to be enough people. There's still not going to be enough money, and there's not going to be enough housing.
No.
And that's part of the problem.
No, I mean, that's why we have
We're
this
not building enough. We're also not building enough.
Yeah, that's why we have this podcast. It's like, for me, honestly, I'm sitting with the uncomfortable questions, because we don't know. And I don't pretend that in any way to think that I could individually make a difference. What we want to do is influence policy more broadly. And that is about folks being able to get access to financing, but it's also about transportation. It's about, where property values are the highest is where there's easily public transport, especially in cities where there's subways. And so redlining, the issues with that go hand in hand with access to transportation as well. And so for me, the thing I'm trying to sit with is, if people have to go farther and farther away from that core, and it costs that much more to get into the city, even if you can afford housing elsewhere, does it actually work for you to come in to the city for work? And because that adds to the cost of childcare, right? All of that distance. And so for me, I'm sitting with the complexity of all of it, and frankly, the racial implications of all of it. And also knowing there's a grief, because like you described, Jay, these neighborhoods that were historically Black because of redlining are being erased, and you can't recover those. You just can't. The housing is too expensive. And so I think one of the main cores of this podcast series is about the fact that because of institutional racism, because of redlining, because of the lack of being able to benefit from equity building in communities, because communities were redlined, even families who have inherited properties, the properties aren't worth enough for them to leverage and do what they would need to do in the current market environment. So it's just stunning. It's like, or if you sell your house that's worth a lot in a historically Black urban neighborhood, you could sell it and do fine and do well, but it means you understand that this is an exit. You're not likely going to be able to turn back around and buy in that same neighborhood. Not necessarily. So that's the stuff I'm just sitting with.
I have a question for you both, or more so looking for your perspective. So some years ago, I went to it was like a real estate seminar, and just trying to understand like the home buying process, etc. And this gentleman was talking about how the school systems and all of that is based upon the property taxes for different houses, right? And I asked the question, and it was awkward because the gentleman was white, the room was full of white folks, I was the only person of color, period, in their room. It was probably about like 50 people. And so I raised my hand and I asked this question. I said, okay, so I understand that banks play a major role in who they accept or deny for mortgages. He goes, yeah. Okay, so the banks are incredibly powerful in the home buying process. And I said, okay, and then the real estate, or the realtor and the real estate agent helps you navigate the process. And then you have this other component, which is your credit score, credit history, all those income, all those other stuff. And I said, okay, but who is the person that says how much a house is worth? And he said, oh, well, yeah, that's easy. That's an appraiser. And I said, okay, so the banks are going to tell the people if they are worthy enough to afford X house. And X house, the value of X house is determined by this person that you call an appraiser. He's like, yes. And I said, okay, so from what it sounds like to me, the appraiser is probably the most powerful person in all of this. Because if the appraiser is going to say this house is worth X amount of dollars, and the person that's looking to buy this house has to go to the bank to get the money that you've deemed that this house is worth, how does that impact an entire community? And he just paused and he thought for a second. And I said, I know I'm not accusing you in anything, but I just want you to give me your honest take on this. How many appraisers of color have you come across in your 30 years in the business? And he turned beet red. And he says, I haven't. And that was the end of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That's no
So I'm
surprise.
curious from your perspective, being in the industry, and Derek, as you as an investor and owning property yourself, does that ring a bell? Is it a visceral feeling for you? Have you seen it before? Have you recognized it? Or was I just poking something that doesn't have no, validation to it?
Mm-hmm. Derek, do you want me to take that?
You can start. I have my own take on it. Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm just humbled by this entire conversation because I could just feel the bigness of it, and even though we're talking about very fundamental, in some ways, elementary ideas, like we know that there's been disinvestment, but when you really sit and stitch it together, it's so big, it's unsettling how to even think about, weave your way through it or around it, which is what you're trying to have us do, Jay. And so in short, yes. If I'm trying to think broadly around the US, I think, yes, the power of what an appraiser says or does is quite impactful in whether or not someone is able to get a mortgage. I would think it more comes into play if someone already has a mortgage and they're trying to refinance to get more cash, like to say that this property has increased in value. Do you agree that the property has increased this much in value such that I can access this equity? That's
generational wealth.
That's right. I think that's a line for sure. Yes, I mean, there are ways that an appraisal at the outset when someone's looking to purchase could be an impediment. I think what's more humbling for me, honestly, that's the much larger impediment, is that at least in a very tight inventory market like Metro Boston, not just the city of Boston, but the surrounding communities. There's just so little housing relative to the number of people who need to buy housing that in order to even come to the table, in order to even be able to purchase, to be able to have your offer seriously considered, you have to have a lot of cash, right? Even though in theory someone could buy with 3% down, you're not likely going to be able to encounter a scenario where there's a house that's in good enough shape that other people want it too, that you can then compete with your 3% down payment, because you're likely going to be competing with people who have 20% or 50% down payments and who are going to have an easier time closing a loan and closing the sale without any worry to the seller. That's what's more the challenge. Or if there's a situation where you could buy with a small down payment because there's not much interest in that property, then you have to think about, well, what's the long term for me? Has this property been, does it have deferred maintenance for decades that then because I only have a 3% down payment, may not have cash to correct? Or am I buying in a neighborhood that has been considered devalued while other neighborhoods around it are increasing in value, such that it's a problem for me if I buy this thing and I'm not planning to live here for the next 30 or 40 years? If I need to sell this house in the near future, am I buying something that could sink in value even more? And can I afford that risk if I only have 3% down? I'm going to have financing of 97%. That's the stuff that is towering. Appraisal is kind of laced in there somewhere, but honestly, that's dwarfed by the fact of being in a housing market where there just isn't enough, and there's a big demand, and that demand is backed by so much cash, because a lot of the people who move here and want to stay have family money to begin with, which is why they could come here and go to university here or be in med school here. And they not only have high income jobs that they're going into or are already in, but they have family wealth that they can rely on to help them make these property purchases. That's the weight at this point.
So, Melanie, this is kind of where you and I sometimes diverge in our opinions.
That's fine.
Because when I think about this question, I go back to what the underlying question is, which is around value. And when we go back, not even that far, when we go back far enough, it's not just about the value of land. It's not just about the value of buildings. People are also valuing other people. And so in the context of this conversation, when we're talking about redlining, it wasn't just about the land. It was also, in the buildings, it was also about the people. There were folks sitting around tables looking at maps saying a certain percentage of Black people live here, a certain percentage of Negroes lives here. This is what we're talking about.
That's
a certain
right.
percentage of Jewish people lives here. And so because of that, or a certain number of poor white people live here, because of that, we are deeming this area to be less valuable.
Unworthy.
Completely unworthy. And then go forward like a half generation. So we're going from the 30s to the 50s, when Black people had a little bit more money and a little bit more agency to move into other neighborhoods.
Especially post-war, after
Yes.
World War II.
Yes.
GI
When they
Bill.
were moving into neighborhoods that were predominantly white or predominantly Jewish, realtors and banks were saying, hey, Black people are moving next door. Your property value is about to decline.
That's right.
Yes, we are. When we're talking about the appraisals, yes, we are talking about the value of the building or the value of the land or the value of the community, but also there's an underlying valuing of people as well, of the actual people. So yes, I think the appraisers have more power than we give them credit for, because they come in, many times they're not from those neighborhoods. They don't have a sense of what's actually valued, how the neighborhood works, how it comes together, like how it's growing and changing. They look at a very small snapshot and a very small space of land. So for example, when I sold my house, they looked at a very narrow strip of land that the house was in, but it wasn't actually like how I would define the neighborhood. They were defining it by two main roads that go sort of south around the larger piece of neighborhood that I was in. But that that piece they were looking at didn't have any relationship to how I actually lived and experienced the neighborhood. Like where I lived and where I experienced it was like was just a very different way of living in that neighborhood. And I would say I was closer to some of the more valuable, quote unquote, valuable parts of Boston than that appraiser had appraised. And part of what made me think about it was just reading all these different articles in the Globe, in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times talking about how there are not enough appraisers of color. And because of that, they don't understand certain neighborhoods of color and why they should be appraised differently than they are. And appraisers would go in and they would see either the homeowners or their photos or something else that would indicate the race of that person. And they would, I don't know if it was automatic or by default or, just through some bias, they would rate those properties lower. And I had read enough of those articles that I actually asked a white friend to drive up from Providence, Rhode Island, and to pose as the seller, to pose as me, just to see if there was any difference. And I, not having done it once myself and then once with him, I don't have a comparison. But I still think that the appraisal came out low. I still do. I don't have any proof to that, but it's just the feeling that I get based upon how properties were being bought and sold around me at much higher amounts. And the fact that I had a unique house, I had a single family house, and many of the properties around me were multifamily. I just feel like it could have appraised for higher. I'm not bitter about it, but I'm just aware.
I don't think you're wrong at all, Derek. Yeah. I think that's all right. And unfortunately, I think that's a small sliver of a challenge for someone who's looking to buy right now. I think, there's nothing about that that's inaccurate. And I also know the absurdity of it. Like I know the absurdity that because the neighborhood you're describing is adjacent to all these higher price neighborhoods, I also personally know appraisers who would highly value a property there almost speculatively because of its adjacencies to some of these communities, because they don't have other points of reference. Like there's just not enough home sales. So it can go either way these days, honestly, because there's so little housing for sale. There's so little to reference. But I think you're right. Often appraisers are coming in and they don't actually have a point of reference. And that is a factor when you're choosing a bank. Like a bank can't handpick an appraiser, but you ideally want to choose a bank that at least works with appraisal companies that are based in the geographic area, that they're not coming, for example, from out of state. Because if so, they will not be able to read what's an economic hub near this property or what the value of having parking on this property versus not is, for example. And so, yeah, all of that is true. And, there are much bigger challenges before you can get to the point of, can I get this property appraised? Because honestly, if the appraise is low, that probably works in your favor as a buyer if you're able to negotiate the price down. It's about, but what the question is about for you're describing, Derek, is as a Black homeowner, you want to be able to sell it as well. Or if you're going to refinance, you want it to be valued high enough that your refinance actually makes financial sense for you. And so, yes, that is certainly a factor where redlining is still impacting the value of people's homes. And it is very much about the value of who lives there. There's no question about that. Yeah. There's no question about that.
And so do you guys think that it's having this information or knowing this, like having this conversation, we all agree that it's important. But there's definitely a part of me that is like, is ignorance bliss? Because because we talked about like the scale of it and the gravity of it, and like it's the humility and just being aware of its scope, right? And it's just like, do you think this information creates more anxiety where that's stemmed from this feeling of hopelessness? Like I can't beat the banks, I can't beat the area, the community. Like I'm just one person. Like how does, because I feel like when I'm in class and I'm passionate and I'm sharing these things and these students and they're like, oh wow, like I never knew. But then the next question is, but now what? You know what I mean? I didn't know that. Thanks for telling me. But now what? You know, and that's where I feel like my angst comes in, is just like, reading all this, knowing all this, having these great conversations, and not being able to do something about it that
Constructive.
feels impactful. You
Yes.
know, like I think having this conversation, this is not to minimize our
Yeah.
conversation at all, but in terms of like, how do we create change at scale? I feel
Yes.
like I don't, even I don't know what to do about it. And this is all the information that I've sort of gathered just from, you know, research. I think it's like one part, it's one thing to like know something, it's another to want to do something about it and feel like you can't.
Yes.
Where do we take this information for our listeners? Like, what do we do with it?
I think that's why we're having this podcast. We're having conversations that we can learn from. There are some speakers that I know Derek and I are going to be thinking about soon, inviting to the podcast who are using, speaking of scale, larger level model ways of thinking about having impact for people who are Black and brown and historically divested communities to be able to access equity, stay where they live, and build. We're trying to think about that. I think the question is about policy and it's about scale ultimately. But there also is the day-to-day, like you're asking, Jay, about these students in their classroom trying to map out their future or just dream of a future. And how can they do that in a way that's practical and isn't just, sort of locked down with despair? And I think that that's where, that's one of the places that I enter, is being very frank with people. I want to be honest about what you can and can't do and why. And then that from there, you figure out how to leverage what you have and what you can do. And you have to plan. And, for me, one of the reasons we've started this podcast is for me to be able to say the thing that I know honestly is that just statistically, white families are going to have an easier time coming up with a plan. They just are. They have family resources to fall back on. They have cash that Black families historically have been kept from building for generations.
Mm-hmm.
That's, to my mind, the biggest challenge, period. So how do we get people access to equity? How do we get people thinking about building and saving and doing so strategically? How do we get them to think about where's the best place to go? And it might mean leaving your home community if you're wanting to own. And so Derek and I even talk about the possibility for people, even if you're not going to own the place you live in, could you invest in property somewhere where you can afford to own property and be a landlord, just to be able to be building an asset in that way? So that's the conversation. Is there are the big picture needs, but then on the ground day to day, being very honest with yourself. But what I don't want is for young Black professionals to feel like, yay, I'm earning all this money and spending it on this high rent and feeling like that's sustainable. I just don't think it is.
Yeah. It's one of the lectures that I do in one of my classes is called it's not personal, it's just business.
Yeah.
And one of the exercises that I have the students share who they believe is the most some of the most powerful, very intentional about the word choice. Who are some of the most powerful businesses in the world? And of course they say Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, like all these things. And none of them, and I've done this probably like 6 or 7 times, none of them say the United States of America. And so I write in the middle of the board, United States of America, comma, Inc., period. And they all just like, wait, what? I was like, I'm not sharing this information with you all for you to take it personal, because America doesn't take it personal.
That's right.
America is a business. It may make us, those business tactics may make us feel a certain way. But if you look at America from a business perspective, it gives you insight on why they choose to make certain decisions. Like redlining.
But being honest that from the very beginning, those business decisions have always been informed by the othering, the subjugation of
absolutely. But they're not going to tell you that though. They're not going to say that. You know what I mean? So I'm looking at it like, look at it from there so we can see both sides of like, why do they feel like so whatever about these people that they are affecting. And this is what this is how we transition into the lecture. I'm like, guys, like gun violence, the war on drugs, redline, like the list can go on and on. That's not because it's a personal thing. They see this all as business decisions to keep the engine to be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery wasn't a personal, that's not a personal thing for them. For us, it was. For those who are affected, it was incredibly personal. It was incredibly hurtful, right? But for them, it's just like, okay, well, if we want to create this economic engine, this is the business decision that we're going to make. And we're still feeling the ripples of that business decision every single day. And now the understanding the history and how they all these things connect, I think gives you a more informed perspective of what I believe is the greatest story ever sold. And that is American Dream. Because when I map out and I ask the class, what does American Dream mean to you? And they say family, they say home ownership, they say education, they say the dog and the white picket fence, and right? Like these are all the things that have been literally indoctrinated in since we were children of what America is, the land of the free and home of the brave. I say, hey guys, this is not the class to debate or whether it's true. I'm just saying this is what they said. This is the story that they sold. We can get into the details later, but again, to your point, Melanie, of just really looking at like how everything connects and being not and trying not to be overwhelmed by the gravity and look at it as like these are insights that can inform you of how to navigate, and you may have to release that personal attachment to a particular community or neighborhood so that you then can start your journey on generational wealth by going in a neighborhood that it maybe is less expensive or more affordable, etc. And so I do think that sometimes having this information is incredibly helpful and validating for those feelings that you have, but it also could be incredibly creating a feeling of hopelessness because it is so big. So I'm constantly grappling with it. So I'm kind of like processing out loud with you both, but that's kind of like how reading these things or reading an article or having these conversations, it's like, it's validating, like, yo, I'm not crazy. Like, I'm not feeling this. I'm not the only one that's feeling this. But then you walk away like, okay, but like Derek said earlier, even if we all band it together, is that going to create enough of a ripple where it could be change at scale? I don't know.
I want that answer to be yes.
I mean, I would hope so. I would hope so. Like, I feel like I'm going to say a couple of closing words. So I feel like part of the issue is that it is such an individualized choice, right? It's not like we can all go to the store and say, hey, I'm going to get a house. Like it's an individualized choice that it's a choice, but also, you know, it also matters in terms of like, what's your credit score? How much money do you make? There's other factors at play. So it's a large issue that theoretically we could change, but in the real world, when it comes to dollars, when it comes to credit scores, when it comes to availability of the asset, that makes it much more complicated. But at the same time, and I hear what you're saying around, you know, it's such a big issue. It can feel daunting. It can feel sort of hard to change. But at the same time, I sort of correlate this issue of real estate and redlining and access to voting and the difficulties with voting. And I remember hearing someone somewhere say, we should all vote because if it didn't matter, they wouldn't make it so hard. And I kind of feel like it's the same thing here, like with redlining, gentrification, blockbusting, all these things. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't have made it so hard. So I feel like, you know, we can't tackle this at scale individually. I don't even know if we can tackle it at scale in a regional or in a statewide or, you know, some other way. But I feel like incremental change has happened over the generations. And I feel like it can continue to happen, but we have to figure out how to navigate the new roadblocks that come into play as they do.
Yeah.
So, Dr. J, we have, you were interviewing us for half of this.
That's my curiosity coming out.
Jay was lecturing and interviewing.
Yes, he was.
Yes. Appreciate it.
Yes. But we've kept you here for a while. We want to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate having you here and for sharing your
It
insights
was
and
a
your
pleasure.
research.
I appreciate y'all. It was a great conversation, and I learned some very different perspectives, and I'm very grateful for you both and your expertise and your experience in the housing and real estate industry.
Well, we hope to see you again in a future conversation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And for those of you who are watching, if you have questions or if you have comments for Dr. J or for any of us, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe so you know when the next episode of the Black Lining Forum drops. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Ciao.